Thank you very much. You're probably wondering what a Talmudist will be doing in the Institute Seminar für Katholische Theologie next year. The answer is that the Talmud is not Protestant, so it must be Catholic. So I begin by reading. I always tell a joke in the beginning, that way I can tell how good people's English is. But maybe the joke was bad. I begin with reading a short passage from the Chabad Hasidic Journal of May 7th, 2013. Right? Chabad, one of the largest and most important of the Hasidic groups today. So they write in their journal, "Dear friend, Jerusalem is never far from our minds. After all, it is there that creation began, and it has been the center of our national devotion for 3,000 years. 3 times a day we face Jerusalem as we pray for the return of God's presence to his holy city. Over 150 years ago, there was a pious and devoted Jew who desired to apply himself to Torah study and prayer in the Holy Land. When he shared his plan with the Rebbe Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, he was taken aback by the Rebbe's response, "Make Israel hear." He did not need to go to Israel. Rather, he was to bring Israel where he lived. Doigkeit. Every time we do another mitzvah, they write, we port a bit of Jerusalem to wherever we are. And when the world is full of such mini Jerusalems, we will all gather in our homeland for real. So far, the Hasidim. Kajik Tololian has written beautifully of what it is that makes a diaspora. He writes, "The Diasporas project, as C.L.R. James understood, is to enhance the articulations between the past and present, homeland and hostland segments of the transnation. Without such connections, however sporadic and discontinuous they may be in arduous practice, to claim that the individual diasporan is a member of the diaspora and that the diasporic segment is a part of the homeland people, which can consist of the descendants of shared ancestors from 3 or 10 generations ago, risks mere biologism." Right? In other words, if there are not current contacts between the segments of the scattered people, then to claim that they are a diaspora becomes a biological, a racial claim. This pitfall, he writes, can be juxtaposed with the mere psychologism that regards diaspora to be the figure of boundary-crossing multiplicity and links a specific individual to that diaspora by virtue of the multiplicity they share, and again of birth. A diaspora is never an accident of birth, a clump of individuals living outside their ancestral homeland, each with a hybrid subjectivity, lacking collective practices that underscore not just their differences from others, but also their similarity to each other. Without some such minimum stringency of definition, most of America, or Argentina, or New Zealand, or Germany, I add, would just as easily be a diaspora. Perhaps diasporas should and must aspire to teach every nation, especially those created by immigration, to see and honor the diasporas within, to transform our self-perception and self-representation. But if we wish to remake the nations of the world in the image of the diaspora, we will not do it by fiats of redefinition, one person at a time. Despite the correct observation just cited from Tololian, redefining things can sometimes be the beginning of a new political vision. So let us begin. Generally, the term diaspora with respect to Jews is used in one of 3 modes, which are not mutually exclusive. It can appear in a kind of timeless geographical sense. The Jews who do not dwell in Palestine, whatever their historical conditions. So, for instance, in the 16th century, all the thriving communities of Jews throughout the Ottoman Empire would be called the diaspora, in contrast to the tiny, if vital, community of refugee Jews from Spain who have landed in Palestine, simply owing to geographical location. Right? So 100 Jews constitute the homeland, and 200,000 the diaspora. Second, it can appear in a chronological sense, the diaspora being understood as a one-time event of scattering from the homeland. Third, in a lachrymose sense, it can be the condition of being an oppressed minority longing to go home. Thus, for instance, in discussing the broadening of the usage of diaspora to refer to Africans, Armenians, and Irish, Robin Cohen writes, quote, "With the Jews, these peoples conceived their scattering as arising from a cataclysmic event that had traumatized the group as a whole, thereby creating the central historical experience of victimhood at the hands of a cruel oppressor," end quote. Cohen, to be sure, complicates this as a controlling definition for diaspora tout court, but leaves it essentially in place as an adequate description of the situation of the Jews. And that is precisely where my intervention takes place. I am proposing a very different approach to the question of diaspora, namely, diaspora as a particular kind of cultural hybridity and as a mode of analysis rather than as an essential thing. Diaspora is most usefully mobilized as a synchronic condition by which human groups are related to one another in space. They may, and frequently do, have an origin in an actually shared past, but need not, and moreover, need not even have a story of such a shared or traumatic past. Cohen allows for such a component, writing that, quote, "Diasporas often mobilize a collective identity, not only a place of settlement or only in respect of an imagined, putative, or real homeland, but also in solidarity with co-ethnic members in other countries. Bonds of language, religion, culture, and a sense of a common fate impregnate such a transnational relationship and give to it an affective, intimate quality that formal citizenship or long settlement frequently lack. A useful description of this sentiment is co-responsibility," end quote. I'm inclined to agree with Cohen while taking much more seriously than he does the element of shared culture. But I would promote this from a marginal to an essential aspect of the description of diaspora. Cohen further writes that in some limited circumstances, the term diaspora can be used to describe transnational bonds of co-responsibility, even where historically exclusive territorial claims are not strongly articulated, end quote. I claim that this is not only a better way of describing the historical experience of Jews, but has to be a defining feature of diaspora as a taxon to distinguish that term from others, migration, exile, displacement, with which it is frequently conflated. As Felix in the introduction, I think it was Felix in the introduction, said the term diaspora is being now so widely used for any kind of migrant or experience, and therefore it has very much lost any real taxonomic or descriptive power. So I am trying to constrain the usage of the term diaspora for a particular situation so that we can usefully use it and not simply misharein everything. That was not bad German, it was good Yiddish, misharein. As Cohen notes, there have been various challenges to the notion of diaspora, owing to its putative association with notions of origin and homeland on the one hand, And on the other, because in this formulation, diaspora, the primary orientation and attachment of diasporic populations is to their homelands and cultures, end quote. The point of my argument is to displace these notions of diaspora, retaining its value and utility for describing particular kinds of cultural practices and solidarity without disputing the existence of others. Once this is said, a homeland, real or even imagined, is not a necessary or sufficient condition for the existence of a diaspora. In the history of a given collective, there can be multiple diasporas. In the history of the Jewish collective, diaspora from Palestine, of course, but also from Babylonia, but also from Bari and Otranto, and from Spain, and from the Rhineland. Shifting homelands, and even diaspora in which homeland is entirely absent and replaced by cultural connections. While trauma is frequently a point of origin or concomitant of diasporic existence, trauma is neither necessary nor sufficient to constitute a diaspora. Cohen writes again, while the increased complexity and deterritorialization of identities are valid phenomena and constitutive of a small minority of diasporas, generally those that had been doubly or multiply displaced over time, ideas of home and often the stronger inflection of homeland remain powerful discourses, end quote. Not so minor, perhaps, as Cohen imagines. What I want to show is that crucial moments of Jewish historical experience fit this minority description much better than traditional ways of describing Jewish diaspora. The 12th century Spanish Jewish author Rabbi Abraham ibn Daud retells a legend of the transfer of Talmudic knowledge from east to west. A ship with 4 Talmudic scholars on board, traveling the Adriatic on its way from Bari to Babylonia in the 9th century, for the support of the yeshivot there, is blown off course and captured by pirates. The 4 scholars are redeemed in 4 different places, and instead of continuing their travel east, end up founding the 4 centers of Talmudic scholarship in the west: Egypt, Tunisia, Spain, and an unspecified 4th place that we might imagine as the Rhineland. The center of learning and power in the Jewish world has now shifted from Babylonia, the east, to the Maghreb and Europe in the west. Note that in very significant ways, this is a diaspora from Babylonia, not from Palestine. This narrative theorizes and represents diaspora in a very different way from how we are used to thinking of it. Indeed, it emblematizes willy-nilly nearly all of the interventions that I wish to make into the conceptualization of diaspora. First, there is no center. These rabbis were traveling from Byzantium towards Babylonia when they were captured and sold by privateers. The location from which they were scattered was not Palestine, not even Babylonia, but Bari on the Adriatic Sea, of which the great 12th century northern French Rabbeinu Tam would say, "For from Bari goes out Torah and the word of God from Otranto." Right? As you know, the original is, "For from Zion goes out Torah and the word of God from Jerusalem." Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem miYerushalayim. But according to Rabbeinu Tam, Ki mibari tetzei Torah udvar Hashem miOtranto. Appropriating and diasporizing the biblical verse. Second, this story is not a record of trauma. The catastrophe here is the capture of the ship. This figures the sometimes, but not always, and not necessarily traumatic or even forced aspect of scattering. Even in this story, the scattering of these rabbis is only productive, not in any way traumatic for them. Each one ends up as the honored rabbinic leader of a major city, Kairouan in Tunisia, Segovia in Spain, and, as I like to imagine, Mainz in the Rhineland, because the Rhineland Jewish communities were founded at about the same time as these others. I am not claiming that diaspora representations are never records of trauma, not in the Jewish or any other situation. They most frequently are. I am suggesting that trauma and oppression are not necessary or the most useful of taxa for describing diasporic situations. Many traumatic dispersions and situations of oppression have simply not issued in diasporas in any meaningful sense. There are, as increasingly recognized, diasporic cultural formations, including some of the Jews, that were formed not out of trauma, but voluntary migration for many other purposes, or even simply produced out of secondary connections between scattered communities. Right? Sometimes scattered communities form connections and then theorize or have a legend of an origin, and that, in my view, is also a diaspora. Third, this new diaspora is a diaspora constituted by the learning of the book, the Babylonian Talmud, which they bring with them, but not even from its source or point of origin. Das ist plötzlich. Ich verstehe nicht warum. But not even from its source or point of origin, but from Byzantine Italy, where its learning was already established. Diaspora follows the diaspora. The center does not hold, and the book becomes the center. Fourth, and most important, this diaspora is constructed as a discursive cultural practice among already existing and thriving Jewish communities, not as a natural consequence of some traumatic founding event. These communities of Jews exist and thrive before they are constituted as diasporic with respect to one another. Instead of the various communities all turning to the Babylonian academies, a series of connections between periphery and one center, now they are connected with one another. The Babylonian Talmud replaces Babylon, which has replaced Palestine as the homeland. The ties that bind this diaspora together are synchronic, their common culture of the study of this book and the language, modes of thought, and practice that come with it. Highly illuminating comparisons can be made to the usage of diaspora in the study of the cultural connections of people of African descent in the world. A nice example of such a synchronically constructed diaspora is cited by Martin Baumann. Referring to the 20th century, he writes, long-established black communities outside the African continent became renamed as diasporas. A unity of those once enslaved thus was and is constructed. A mythical relation of all overseas blacks with an idealized Africa arose. And politically, former and present power relations were pointed out and questioned. Right? These people did not conceive of themselves as Africans until the 20th century. They came from Kenya, Nigeria, Dahomey, Cameroon. But they become Africans in the 20th century and thus constituting an African diaspora. Brent Hayes Edwards even more usefully articulates what it is that constructs these alliances as diasporic, their shared cultural practice. Writing, of course, black artists and intellectuals from Edward Wilmot Blyden, Martin Delany, and Pauline Hopkins in the 19th century to W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Tiamoko Garan Kouyaté in the early 20th have long been engaged with themes of internationalism, but diaspora has only in the past 40 years been a term of choice to express the links and commonalities among groups of African descent throughout the world. One of the most important aspects of the history of African diaspora is that the object Africa is clearly and avowedly a construct. I mentioned this before. African-descended people around the world did not come from a place called Africa, but from Dahomey, Cameroon, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and so on. Places of distinct historical and cultural identities. As Du Bois famously wrote, the idea of one Africa to unite the thought and ideals of all native peoples of the Dark Continent belongs to the 20th century and stems naturally from where? From the West Indies and the United States. Here, various groups of Africans, quite separate in origin, became so united in experience and so exposed to the impact of new cultures that they began to think of Africa as one idea and one land. We can observe a close analogy to the ideas concretized in the narrative of the four captives, the making in time of a diaspora as a cultural production. It matters not for Jewish culture whether the land of Israel as origin is a similar construct. What is important is that the diaspora is produced in real time out of the narratives of such an originary land and out of the current robust cultural connections sustained in part by that narrative. Among diaspora theorists, Cohen has made a major advance over previous scholars in pointing to the collective identity formation mobilized by diasporas, not only a place of settlement or only in respect of an imagined putative or real homeland, but also in solidarity with co-ethnic members in other countries. Cohen has realized that this implies that there need not be a traumatic dispersal from a particular homeland to constitute a diaspora. I want to build on Cohen, but treat the deterritorialized diaspora not as a special case or exceptional form of diaspora, but rather as its ideal type in the Weberian sense. I propose once more that diaspora be understood as a synchronic cultural situation applicable to people who participate in a doubled cultural and frequently a doubled linguistic location in which they share a culture with the place in which they dwell, but also with another group of people who live elsewhere, in which they have a local and a translocal cultural identity and expression at the same time, right? So people who live in a place and are oriented culturally and linguistically twice, once to the place of local habitation and once to groups separate in space that share with them a second language or second culture. None of this needs implied trauma, an original scene of forced dispersion, a longing for a homeland, or even the existence of a myth of one homeland. Finbar Barry Flood's comments on the Islamic Ummah are certainly apposite here. The idea of mobility is, however, intrinsic to the history and prescriptions of Islam, a religion whose year zero is measured not from the birth of the Prophet, but from the migration of the nascent Muslim community from Mecca to Medina. Moreover, the duty to make the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime imbues Islam with an institution that is global in its extent and impact, not least on the circulation of artistic concepts and forms. Without entailing a deterritorialized concept of identity, the need to negotiate between the local and the translocal, the lived experience of the quotidian and the ideal of the Ummah, an imagined community with a global reach, has been a distinguishing figure of Islamic cultures from their inception. Although Flood does not use the terminology of diaspora here, it is that sense of a negotiation of local and translocal that marks my interpretation of Ibn Dawood and of Jewish diaspora more broadly. Note that the word Ummah is the same word that Jewish Arab writers used to describe their peoplehood. So Sadia Gaon in the 10th century or Rabbi Yehuda Levi in the 12th century refer to the Jewish people as Ummah, and they refer to the Muslims as Ummah and to the Christians as an Ummah also. Obviously, a Muslim Ummah in a diaspora comprising Spaniards, Arabs, Persians, Chinese, and Indonesians is a diaspora that has come into being through cultural and religious contacts, not one that has been, traumatically or not, scattered from a putative originary homeland. Right? The largest number of Muslims in the world, of course, are Indonesians, and they hardly have a myth of having ridden, that they came riding to Indonesia out of the desert. There should be no mistake. Makkah is not the homeland that produces this diaspora, any more than there are connections with people back home. Makkah is the holy city. Pilgrimage there is the practice that enables the doubled location of the communities of the Ummah, including their shared artistic practices, which are then located in two contexts and locations, the translocal Islamic one and the local traditions and conditions of artistic practice. Think, for instance, of Turkish and Persian Islamic art. It is these doubled and shared practices that would inspire me to refer to the Ummah as a diaspora. Similarly, for the medieval Jewish diaspora, as for the Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem remains, of course, the holy city, and the land of Israel the Holy Land. Remember the Hasidic quote from the beginning. But in no meaningful sense is it a homeland. Certainly there may be no connection with folks back home from the early Middle Ages on, because there weren't any folks back home. These two concepts need better delineation, especially within the study of Jews and their histories. What renders Jewry diasporic are the connections with other Jews in other places all over the world, owing to common cultural discourses and practices, primarily, I would argue, the study of Talmud. This comparison with the Ummah bears out the usefulness of my assertion that the best way to conceive of diaspora is as a synchronic condition in which a given collective is oriented twice, once toward the place they are in, and once again toward another place, once toward a local culture, and once toward a culture that they share with other related collectives that are not in their place. Ibn Dawood himself is a perfect example of such double orientation. On the one hand, as we have seen, he was the great champion of traditional Talmudic learning and the prophet of its spread in his Arabic-speaking world. On the other hand, he was the figure who introduced Aristotelianism and the philosophy of Avicenna and Sina into Jewish culture. Not only that, but he continues to attract the attention of scholars of Latin philosophy, too, since there are indications that Ibn Dawood is the Aben Daoud who cooperated with Dominicus Gundisalinus in translating philosophical texts from Arabic into Latin. Right? So a perfect example of this double cultural location. Where he is in Spain, he is engaged with Aristotelian philosophy, with Avicenna, with translating from Arabic philosophy into Latin, and at the same time he is one of the leaders and champions of Talmudic study throughout the diaspora. The dual orientation of his cultural commitments to the translocal Talmudic study and to the philosophical culture of Arabic and Latin Spain marks Ibn Dawood as the perfect figure of diaspora. Similarly, Hanagid and his panegyricist Ibn Gvirol are perfect figures of diasporic culture. Hanagid, in addition to being a great Talmudist and Hebrew poet, was appointed vizier in Spain and general of the armies in 1027. I tell you, I read an article many years ago about the Nagid as a vizier and a general of the army of Granada. And this historian of Spain in the first footnote said, my colleague so-and-so informs me that he was in addition an accomplished Hebrew poet. Of course, from our perspective, he was a great Hebrew poet and Talmudist who also was a vizier and a general. Ibn Gvirol also is known better in Europe as Avi Sebron, author of the great Neoplatonist allegorical poem Fons Vitae, and even thought in Europe to have been a Christian until the 19th century when Solomon Munk demonstrated that Avi Sebron was in fact the Jew Ibn Gvirol. This reconfigured notion of Jewish diasporic history leads not only to a re-evaluation of the meaning of diaspora in Jewish history, but also allows us to revise our understanding of the heuristic value of the concept diaspora tout court. Where once there was diaspora, now there are diasporas. Earlier in the present critical moment, there were attempts to essentialize and define precisely and normatively of what a diaspora consists, i.e., who is in and who is out. In his germinal paper for modern diaspora theory, William Safran has offered the following definition. He writes, "I suggest that the concept of diaspora be applied to expatriate minority communities whose members share several of the following characteristics. 1. They or their ancestors have been dispersed from a specific original center to 2 or more peripheral or foreign regions. 2. They retain a collective memory, vision, or myth about their original homeland, its physical location, history, and achievements. 3. They believe that they are not and perhaps cannot be fully accepted by their host society and therefore feel partly alienated and insulated from it. 4. They regard their ancestral homeland as their true ideal home and as the place to which they or their descendants would or should eventually return when conditions are appropriate. 5. They believe that they should collectively be committed to the maintenance or restoration of their original homeland and to its safety and prosperity. And 6. They continue to relate personally or vicariously to that homeland in one way or another, and their ethno-communal consciousness and solidarity are importantly defined by the existence of such a relationship." In terms of that definition, I'm still reading from Safran, we may legitimately speak of the Armenian, Maghrebi, Turkish, Palestinian, Cuban, Greek, and perhaps Chinese diasporas at present, and of the Polish diaspora of the past, although none of them fully conforms to the ideal type of the Jewish diaspora. Let me just comment on this term, the Polish diaspora of the past. How could there be a Polish diaspora in the past and not now? It's not because all the Poles have gone back to Poland. It's because the cultural connections and language that brought together Poles in the United States and in England and in Germany have in the last 50 years largely been severed. There isn't Polish cultural activity in many parts of the world. Polish language and literature have died out, not everywhere, of course, and certainly not in Poland, but in many other places. What is remarkable about these definitions, aside from the fact that they do not hold up, right, that they are not correct, is the claim that the Jewish diaspora is an ideal type. Warum? Recently, Rogers Brubaker has explored this theme more explicitly. Most early discussions of diaspora were firmly rooted in a conceptual homeland. They were concerned with a paradigmatic case or a small number of core cases. The paradigmatic case was, of course, the Jewish diaspora. As discussions of diasporas began to branch out to include other cases, they remained oriented, at least initially, to this conceptual homeland, to the Jewish case, and the other classical diasporas, Armenian and Greek. When historian George Shepperson introduced the notion of the African diaspora, for example, he did so by expressly engaging the Jewish experience. The Palestinian diaspora, too, has been construed as a catastrophic diaspora, or in Cohen's term, a victim diaspora, on the model of the Jewish case. As Clifford put it, we should be able to recognize the strong entailment of Jewish history on the language of diaspora without making that history a definitive model. Jewish and Greek and Armenian diasporas can be taken as non-normative starting points for a discourse that is traveling or hybridizing in new global conditions. These attempts are partly an effort to reclaim the name diaspora, if not, certainly not for the Jews alone, then for a specific sort of historical situation, rescuing it from its latter-day trendiness, which has threatened to dissolve the term into nothingness. As Martin Baumann, along with others, has remarked, the semantic broadening of diaspora, both in terms of relating it to any dispersed group of people and to conceptualize a certain type of consciousness, have made diaspora one of the most fashionable terms in academic discourse of the late 20th century. Authors and writers use the once restricted notion in an arbitrary, unspecified, fairly free way, end quote. If the term diaspora needs to be rescued to maintain some kind of specificity, we would do well to attend carefully to the historical specificities of historical communities. I know something about Jews. One of the greatest difficulties with most accounts of Jewish diaspora is that they are ahistorical, treating diaspora as an essence, a Platonic idea, and refusing to pay attention to the ever-changing and developing conditions of Jewish life through time and space. Thus Cohen writes, with respect to the psalm by the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered thee, O Zion. He writes of this, the loneliness and sadness of the diasporic experience of the Jews is poignantly evoked in this psalm. Such evocations are common, end quote. Cohen does his best to complicate this picture. But the very terms of this initial statement render his job of nuancing extremely difficult, if not impossible. His very assumption or positing of the diasporic experience of the Jews, as if my experience and the experience of a 15th century Jew in Altona and a 9th century Jew in Spain and a 6th century Jew in Babylonia are the same experience, the experience. His very assumption of positing the diasporic experience of the Jews is the problem. And starting off with such terminology, conceptual apparatus renders a solution very distant. While he recognizes, for instance, that Jewish migratory experiences were much more diverse and more complex than the catastrophic tradition allows, he indicts his critical task as, listen to this, to interrogate and supersede the Jewish tradition. Rather strange language. To interrogate and supersede the Jewish tradition, rather than to interrogate whether his account of the Jewish tradition is accurate or not. He further compounds the difficulty by making unsupported statements such as diaspora evolved as the preferred and catch-all expression covering sin, scattering, emigration, and the possibilities of repentance and return. And I ask, among which Jews? At what time? In which language? Or languages? The word doesn't even exist, of course, in Hebrew or Yiddish. And in the Septuagint, it is not used as the translation equivalent of Gola or Galut. Diaspora in the Bible, in the Greek Bible, is not the translation of Gola and Galut. It has to do with the settling in other places, but not the scattering or the exiling. There are other terms for that. As Bauman observes in explaining that the Septuagint does not translate the Hebrew terms for exile by diaspora, in retrospect, post-Babylonian Jews theologically interpreted the Babylonian captivity as God's punishment for their disobedience to the commands of the Torah. With the return to Palestine and Jerusalem in the late 6th century BC, this punishment had come to an end. 6th century BC. Living outside the Holy Land subsequently, that is, from the 5th century BC on, was understood differently. It was not an imposed punishment for breaking the laws of God. It involved no deportation, as donated by the Hebrew terms Gola and Galut. These terms were translated by many other words in Greek, such as eichmalosia, captivity, and metoikesia, moving under force, but not by the term diaspora. Cohen even delivers himself of the startling pronouncement that Babylon subsequently became a code word among Jews for the afflictions, isolation, and insecurity of living in a foreign place, set adrift, cut off from their roots and their sense of identity, oppressed by an alien ruling class, end quote. This statement simply ignores the fact that only in one particular type of Jewish literature is this even somewhat the case, namely apocalyptic. While in rabbinic texts, apocalyptic such as For Ezra, Revelation, or Bob Marley, while in rabbinic texts, to the best of my knowledge, Babylon never functions in this sense. More startling, we discover from him that one narrative, promoted often by Zionists and religious leaders in the tradition of Ezra and the prophets, depicts the Babylonian and Sephardi experiences as a wholly negative process of deracination, end quote. Come again? Are we to understand that the religious leaders rejected the Babylonian Talmud, as well as the rabbinical literature and liturgical poetry of the Sephardi, the Spanish Jews, owing to their religious leaders' alleged allegiance to the Babylonian Ezra? It's complete and total incoherent nonsense. Given this absolute straw man, Cohen sets out to suggest a revisionist view of Babylon. But it seems that it's only his view that needs revisioning, not some putative Jewish tradition that needs superseding. I cite and criticize Cohen here, perhaps too harshly, not because he is exceptional in usage of the alleged experience of the Jews in theorizing diaspora, but because he is all too typical of such efforts. On the one hand, we have writers such as Safran and his ilk, who seek to define Jewish diaspora essentialistically and in accord with what is essentially Zionist ideology, and use it as a regulating gate check for the legitimacy of applying the term to others. On the other hand, we have those who, accepting the same definitions of Jewish diaspora, seek to define Jewish experience as not being diasporic, or not diasporic enough, because it, in the form of a mythical, eternal Zionism, the ewiger Zionismus, seeks only to return home, and in Stuart Hall's memorable phrase, to drive the indigenes into the sea. Zionism, which is the privation of diaspora, the avowed enemy of diasporic Jewishness, is taken as the essential affirmation and description of historical Jewish experience, which is then named as not diasporic and ordained for supersession. Cohen's is arguably the best of the lot, and therefore necessitates the kind of critique that I have offered here. What I argue is that Jewish diaspora, like that of blacks as evoked by Gilroy, cannot be reversed, although it can be dissipated and destroyed. If Jews' connection with their own cultural practices, with our own cultural practices, become sufficiently attenuated, if we lose our languages, if we lose our study of our books, if we lose our practices and customs, and even our food ways, then there's no more diaspora. Given the regulating force of Jewish diaspora, whether ideal type or model to be superseded, it becomes clear why it is so important to get the Jewish diaspora right, some version of right, and not one that is descriptively, manifestly untrue with respect to the historical or literary record. Just as for black folk, in a transnational circuit, then articulation offers the means to account for the diversity of black takes on diaspora, which Hall himself explicitly begins to theorize in the late 1980s as a frame of cultural identity determined not through return, but through difference, not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a concept of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference. So too for Jew folk. Just as, according to Edwards, diaspora was mobilized with regard to black studies to break with a depoliticizing emphasis on unity and unidirectional return in mid-century black internationalist scholarship, such has been its use in modern Jewish discourse as well. I could say with Edwards, mutatis mutandis, I am rethinking the uses of diaspora more precisely to compel a discussion of the politics of nominalization In a moment of prolixity and careless rhetoric, when such a question is often the first casualty, an intellectual history of the term is needed. In other words, because diaspora is taken up at a particular conjunction in Black scholarly discourse to do a particular kind of epistemological work. And that's the kind of epistemological work we need to be doing in Jewish studies as well, and as a contribution to more adequate theorization and description of diaspora. It is not so much, I will suggest, that previous descriptions are entirely wrong, but that there is within Jewish culture itself, within the classic instance of diaspora, the Jews of Babylonia, an entirely different self-understanding, on the one hand, and a set of cultural practices, those produced and defined by the Babylonian Talmud, that belie those terms. The Talmud, in its textual practices, produces Babylonia as a homeland. And since this Babylonia is produced by a text that can move, that homeland becomes portable and reproduces itself over and over. It reproduces itself, moreover, in the form of the shared literary life of World Hebrew, of Yiddish, of Ladino, and of Judeo-Arabic, as well as several other smaller language groups. The Talmud, I would submit, is not only the classical work of the rabbinic period produced outside the land of Israel, it is a Diasporas manifesto. Diasporas manifesto number 1.